Welcome, everyone. I'm Deacon Vicki Hanrahan, Assistant to the Bishop for Synodical Life. Thanks for joining us for this Equipping the Saints webinar. You know, one of the blessings that have come to the fore during this time of the pandemic is that countless churches like yourselves have learned to do digital ministry in this time. And so I think we're beginning to understand that knowing how to live stream a service or how to use an FM transmitter is just the beginning. And we seem to have spotlight. Who's that? Fisher, right? Hi, thanks for joining us. But I think we're beginning to understand that knowing how to live stream a service or how to use an FM transmitter is really just the beginning. So now we need to make sure we understand the culture of this unique form of community and how to not only reach people who share this digital space, but also how to engage them. So we've invited someone who can help lead the way and help us to consider the right questions to ask as we navigate going forward. Okay. So I'm putting my gallery view on here so I can see everybody tonight. During the presentation, feel free to write down questions or comments that come to mind in the chat area as we've done before, and Ryan will address those as he is able to. Thank you to Robin on our staff who's going to be organizing us for a breakout a little bit later in this session, and for keeping everything organized for tonight's webinar. Also a note, we are recording this webinar for those who are unable to make it. And then of course, if you want to go back and reference anything that you might have missed. All of our recordings for our webinars are available on our Synod website at www.scsw-elca.org/webinars. And I'll put that link in the chat below. Now, before I introduce tonight's presenter, let us start with a word of prayer and turn to the one who motivates our work. Let us pray. Lord of life, we thank you for the opportunity to gather this night. May everything we do and talk about begin with your inspiration and continue with your help. We ask for your blessing upon all gathered here tonight, that they leave here a little better equipped to do your will as they continue to connect their community for your holy purposes. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. And now I invite you to turn your attention to our leader for tonight's webinar. Ryan Panzer is an instructional designer. He's a lifetime Christian leader. He's a former Google employee for about 10 years, and he's a current Zendesk employee. He might mention that. He is a regular speaker on the topic of working with all different faith traditions, and especially Lutherans. And he has authored a book that will be published in December by Augsburg Fortress called Grace and Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. We had planned to have Ryan join us in September, and so this is right on schedule, but when we were planning this, I don't think we even appreciated how especially timely this webinar would be. So we look forward to this conversation with you, and so without further delay, Ryan Panzer.
Hey, thanks Deacon Vicki, and thank you to all of you for making time for another Zoom call in a time where so many of us are trying to keep our organizations, our churches moving forward, and adjusting to this new normal of work from home and connecting digitally. My name is Ryan Panzer. I'm a instructional designer and a researcher of the experience of ministry in a digital age. And as Vicki said, the author of a book called Grace and Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. This evening, we're going to be talking about getting started with online worship and community building. And you might think it's curious to call a webinar this late into the game of doing church online, getting started. But I think what will emerge throughout our time together tonight is the idea that even though the pandemic will end, and it will end, The fact is that the church's future is a digital future. And even as our buildings reopen, worship will continue to have an online expression. Our church communities and their lives together will continue to gather in ways both in person and virtual. So even though the pandemic will end, we are truly just getting started with the topics of online worship and community. Just a little bit about my background. I live down the road in the southwest side of Madison. I'm a member of Good Shepherd Lutheran Church. Here you see me in May of 2019 with my small group confirmation class from Good Shepherd. And I've been around the Madison area for a number of years, including attending campus ministry at Lutheran Campus Ministry in Madison. So it's good to see so many familiar faces, and looking forward to catching up with a number of you in person when it's safe to do so. Tonight's agenda, then, we're going to talk about a few different topics. We'll cover the idea of why technology matters. And it doesn't just matter because it's the way we have to do worship during a pandemic. It matters because it's the way our culture connects. And as church leaders called to bring the gospel message to our culture, it's one of the tools we have to reach them. Accordingly, we're going to be talking about how the internet has really become the new mission field for Christian leadership today. We'll get into some theology and some trends with internet usage. And what you'll see from that is how far behind so many churches were prior to March of 2020. Now, we've caught up a lot in the last 6 months, but there's still a fair bit to learn. We're going to close by talking a little bit about the areas of worship and community building. I'll offer just a few suggestions on next steps in each of those areas. All of you have been working on worship and community building online for quite some time. So in that section, I'm hoping to offer you some potential ideas for continuing to innovate as you consider what's next for your congregation. And finally, at the close of our time together tonight, we'll have some breakout discussion where you can gather with all those who are on this call for a time to ask questions, to see what's working for others within this topic of church in a digital age. A couple of logistical items then. I have the chat open on my screen, so if you have questions, I'll pause several times throughout tonight's webinar. Feel free to unmute yourself. We've got a small enough group and ask them aloud, or if you would feel more comfortable, you can also post them in the Zoom chat and I'll see them there as well. I want to start with a little poll though. 6 months into the 6-month anniversary of doing church online, going back to the start of all of this, Sunday, March 13th was the first Sunday that so many of us were doing church online. And I want to know how you're feeling about things on a scale of Macaulay Culkin in Home Alone to perplexed Nicolas Cage, to thumbs up kid, to success baby. How are you feeling about doing church online this far in? Take a second and answer that poll if you would. And then Robin or Vicky, if one of you could please share the results of the poll. Yeah. All right, so thank you to everyone who responded. We had a pretty even split here, with 2/3 of us saying they identify most closely with perplexed Nicolas Cage, unsure what to do next. Should they continue to innovate doing church online, or should they go and try to steal the Declaration of Independence? So a few of us would rate ourselves as, I think Brett Rambo is that kid's name, giving the thumbs up. And I may have been the only one to respond as feeling like success baby. So my hope for today is that our time together will at least be able to move those of you who identify as perplexed Nicolas Cage to the Brett Rambo thumbs up stage. So let's talk about why technology matters. And I talk about this, obviously, not just in the context of it matters because it's the way we have to do church during the pandemic, but because I want you to see how important technology is, not just to how we do church, but to how our broader culture is thinking about faith and thinking about spirituality. And to start, I want to share a quick story with one of the most ubiquitous forms of technology that all of us have access to, the Google search engine. So this April, I found myself with some more time on my hands than I usually have on my hands, and I was wondering what I should do to fill all that time. Well, I noticed I had a wooden table in my backyard, and it had taken a little bit of a beating from rain and sun and wind over the years. And I started to think, well, maybe I ought to refinish that table. So like any learner in the digital age, I turned to google.com and I asked a question. How do I refinish my dining room table? Google responded with a number of ideas. It gave me some step-by-step directions, sanding, removing sanding dust, applying stain with a brush. But my favorite part about what Google did is it provided a number of other ideas, further questions to ask to explore in more detail the idea of refinishing a table. It encouraged me to ask how much it costs to refinish a dining room table. It turns out it costs more than you might think. It encouraged me to ask how long it takes to refinish a dining room table. And it takes a really long time, especially when you're sanding something. Finally, Google provided the suggestion of asking, how do you strip and restain a dining room table? And in my case, the answer to that was very carefully, very slowly, while making a lot of mistakes along the way. I share this with you not because a lot of people have been turning to Google to learn how to do new things during this time of pandemic when we're all virtually distributed and many of us are spending a lot more time at home. But because when we look at the search data from Google, a lot of people are turning to the search engine to figure out what's up with Jesus, to figure out what's up with God, to even explore different areas of spiritual practice. So this is a screenshot of Google Trends, which aggregates search volume data over time. What you'll see here is the number 25 and the number 100. So the fact that we have the number 100, this corresponds to 2020, as compared to the number 25 in 2008, means that there is now 4 times as much search interest in the term "who is Jesus" than there was 12 years ago. So if we ever think that us in the church are telling a story that millennials and younger generations who are more technologically driven are disinterested in, this data should perhaps give us pause. Similarly, there's a lot of interest on Google about the Bible. This year, we saw about a 1/3 increase in the number of search queries for what is the Bible. Again, what all of us are tasked with, bringing the gospel story to a digital age, is something that our digital age appears to have quite a bit of interest in learning about. Perhaps the sombering news for those of us who work in the church is that search interest in church does not mirror the rising increase for searches in like who is Jesus or what is the Bible. In fact, search query interest in the term church has fallen off by about 1/4 since 2008. This is one of the aspects of technology that gives me a little bit of heartburn in recognizing that though there's a lot of interest in the story we have to share, there's not as much interest in the institutions we all represent. Now, I think part of this has been accelerated by the news recently. And I find it interesting that at the very worst so far of the COVID-19 pandemic, in those mid-April days when the death toll was very high, particularly from the United States East Coast, Google saw its largest single day search volume for the word prayer. In perhaps one of the darkest moments in our nation's recent history, more people were trying to learn and explore what it means to pray, thinking that perhaps prayer might offer them a light in the darkness. So digital technology doesn't just matter because it's how we do church online during a pandemic. Digital technology matters because it's the tool that our culture is using to learn, but specifically to learn about who God is and what God has to do with their life. So before I get into the idea of the internet as a mission field, I want to pause there to see if there's any questions or comments so far. Either feel free to shout them out or to type them into the Zoom chat.
Ryan, Jim Hearn here. I'm just curious, how far back can you capture Google searches? I'd be curious to know, like, around September 11th, 2001, and like the months right and following that, like what those searches, Jesus, Bible, church, would have looked like then. I don't know if that data is available.
It's a really interesting question. I believe Google Trends only goes back to 2008, but I would suspect that it would be a similar spike in those searches around September 2001. I think that the reality is that when there's a crisis, people lean into their faith and want to explore more, and the Google data would support that. Kelly Fisher posted in the Zoom chat, is it possible to know what age groups searched for what? While Google search doesn't differentiate based on age group, you can drill down into specific locations. So check out the trend. Check out the tool. I'll put it in the Zoom chat here. The name of the tool is Google Trends. It's free to access. It's kind of a barometer of where culture is at, of what kind of things folks are interested in. Oh, I just got a direct message from Andy who says the data for Jesus goes back to 2004. So very interesting. So we have 16 years of data there. One more question. Meredith asks, have you found the information in line with Lutheran? Yes, Meredith, I have looked at those trends, and you can look at different permutations of the word Lutheran and you're going to get different results, but the search query Lutheran church, where you enter in any kind of mainline Protestant church, you're going to see an overall slow decrease in search interest. And then Andy points out to me via a direct message, an increasing trend for Jesus since 2004. Yeah, certainly. So that's kind of where we're at, right? We have this expanding increase in the story we have to tell, just as we see a waning interest in the institution that we represent that is here to tell that story. All of that affords an opportunity, though, to think about the internet as a mission field, as not just a set of technologies, but a place where we can reach people and tell them about God's story and God's grace and provide that light in the darkness that so many are seeking. So I won't share the name of the pastor, but I heard this quote shortly after I enrolled in seminary a few years ago. So I'm an MA of Luther Seminary, and I completed my degree online. So it was a distributed learning program where I spent 50 weeks per year studying on my computer. I spent 2 weeks per year on St. Paul's Luther Seminary campus. And I had a pastor say to me right after I finished my application paperwork, you know, it's a shame you'll miss out on experiencing that community. Now, ironically, the community for Luther Seminary online students is considered to be much stronger than the community for the in-person students. Every time the online students are on campus together, it's like a big family reunion. It's truly a joyful occasion. And I've even heard faculty members remark, it's amazing how strong the community is for a group that never seems to gather much in person. Now, Martin Luther tells us that the most important work and service we can perform as church people is to bring to the knowledge of God by the Holy Gospel to those who are entrusted to us. And what I think that anonymous pastor who was skeptical of getting a theological education online was missing out on is that those who are entrusted to us are very much immersed in this digital ecosystem. And if we're going to bring to them the knowledge of God by the Holy Gospel, we ought to be there too. I like to show this not just to amaze folks by how many millennials own a smartphone or are on social media, almost 100% on both counts. But it's remarkable that every single generation has been steadily increasing their usage of mobile devices, of tablet computers, and of smartphone applications. This is a 9 years worth of data from the Pew Research Center. And what I always point out here is that the silent generation, born 1945 and earlier, is one of the fastest growing adopters of both mobile technology and social media. I think about my grandma who recently passed away, and how in her last months, she was active on Instagram. She got an account so she could keep in touch with her grandkids and see what her grandkids were doing at school, in the workplace, and so she could follow her great granddaughters as well. Facebook, of course, is the largest social media network, continues to be the largest social media network. I would be surprised if that ever changes. You'll see that every generation cohort is growing in its usage of Facebook, and even the silent generation, those born before 1945, are increasingly adopting this social media. These trends have only accelerated during COVID. So going back to the start of the pandemic, we've seen a 27% increase in Facebook usage. And as a degree of scale, that's pretty remarkable given that Facebook had nearly 150 million daily users prior to COVID-19. Similarly, we've seen a 16% increase in Netflix usage, a 15% increase in YouTube usage. During this time of pandemic and this time of uncertainty, more and more folks are going online and they're doing a lot of things online. The story isn't so rosy for churches. Prior to COVID-19, only about half of us had a website. About a third of our buildings didn't have any kind of internet access, and about half of all churches weren't using social media. So these trends have obviously changed a great deal since 6 months ago. But I think this data, combined with that pastor's quote from the beginning of the section, just highlights how we in church have some catching up to do in this area. Part of the reason we have some catching up to do is there's been a sentiment that's been widespread in Christian communities for many years, well before COVID-19, that virtual connectedness was somehow inauthentic, that the relationships that happen in virtual space just don't mean as much as the relationships that form through face-to-face encounters. To anyone who thinks that way, I would commend Deanna Thompson's book, The Virtual Body of Christ in a Suffering World. Deanna tells us in this book about her journey with cancer and how she went from being a skeptic of digital technology to really embracing the community that she found there, and specifically the community that she found through her Caring Bridge page. Now, if some of you may be familiar with Caring Bridge, it's a website that allows family and friends to leave messages of support and encouragement to those who are dealing with chronic illness. And what I think is interesting about Caring Bridge is it's actually a very simple technology. It's not by any means this flashy service. It's not high tech whatsoever. It's simply a bulletin board. And here with Deanna Thompson, it was the tool that enabled Deanna to get through some of the hardest times of her illness. All this is to say that when we gather online, even though we're not gathering face-to-face, those gatherings are very real. Professor Heidi Campbell from Texas A&M is one of the world's leading scholars on religion and new media, or religion and the internet. And when I talked to her as part of the research for my book, Dr. Campbell talked about St. Paul and how St. Paul wrote all these letters to these far-flung areas across the ancient Near East and across Western Europe. And nobody ever thought Paul was being inauthentic or that the relationships Paul formed were in any way somehow less than. Paul used letter writing. We might use Facebook posts. It's really no different in the digital age. We're still in the business of relationships. We're still in the business of connecting. All of this is still aimed at starting conversations. So with that ecclesiology in mind, I might suggest that any church leader, when we set out to think about being the church online, ought to carry with them three mindsets. Now, the first mindset is that the culture of our digital age matters a lot more than any individual technologies. Technologies come and go. They have their time and then they fizzle out. But what doesn't change is what those who are using that technology value, the way they think, the way they learn, and the way they believe. I think this is perhaps exemplified by search engines. You can think of all the search engines that have come and gone over the years. Even mighty Google might come and go someday. But search engines have really permeated throughout our entire culture. You can see search engines on everything from smartphones to smart speakers to laundry machines and thermostats. The experience of asking questions of a search engine is so ubiquitous in our culture that people have come to expect the ability to ask lots of questions as part of human interaction. So our first mindset then is that technology changes culture, but culture is more stable, more important for us as church leaders to think about than technology. The second mindset then is that there are certain values within our tech-shaped culture, certain values that are unique to digital technology. And fairly or not, there are some perceptions of the church and where the church stands relative to those values of a digital culture. One of those perceptions, and I see these perceptions on display when I talk to my coworkers in the tech industry, many of whom haven't set foot in their church since perhaps their wedding day or even their confirmation day. So one of those perceptions is the idea that the church is fundamentally an organization that stands for proclamation. As those living in a digital culture, they're primarily focused on asking questions. Another perception, fair or not, is that church is primarily about hierarchy. Those who live and swim in this world of technology are much more comfortable with the idea of collaboration. You see this with Google Docs. You even see this with Zoom. So perhaps they don't feel comfortable thinking about church because they see collaboration and hierarchy as incompatible. Those living in the digital age are accustomed to hybrid connections that span together the online and the offline experience. The perception of church, fair or not, is that a church is an in-person building that's open approximately 1 hour a week on Sunday mornings. That's changed a little bit in recent months, but the perception is still there, and the discontinuity between a world that simultaneously lives online and offline and an institution that seems to have its building open for 1 hour a week. And then there's the perception that the church is kind of an experience of passivity, that you go and you sit and you listen, and then you leave. Whereas those who live and breathe in this digital ecosystem really seem to value creativity, the ability to construct, the ability to make things, the ability to tell their own stories. And I say this not to in any way disparage the church or the church leaders. I think if any organization has done a remarkable job since March, it's Christian organizations. The speed at which we adapted, pivoted, moved into a new way of achieving our mission and proclaiming the gospel is remarkable. And I think perhaps the only other organization that's moved as nimbly as churches through these times are schools. The third mindset that we ought to think about then is this idea of digital minimalism. When we in the church think about technology, we should remember that technology is always going to move faster than we are. The goal of Christian ministry is not to adopt 100% of all technologies in all times and all places. So if you think you can't keep up with the pace of technological change, you're probably right. That'd be accurate of me too. So what you want to do when you think about technology is to start by considering your community and start by thinking about your mission and how to fulfill that mission in the context of a tech-shaped culture. That should inform our technology usage. As church leaders, we should never be using individual technologies just for the sake of doing them. We should always be asking the question of why. Why is this technology important to helping us to reach a community with this specific mission in mind? I have a book recommendation, kind of a secular book. Cal Newport is a computer scientist at Georgetown University. He wrote this book, Digital Minimalism, Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. And it's an excellent overview of the idea, a little bit countercultural, that technology is a set of tools that should serve our values. Technology is not a value in and of itself. So when we talk about things like worship, when we talk about building community online, the answer is not to try every technology, throw it all against the wall and see what sticks. The answer is to think about, what does our community really need, and what one or two technologies are going to best enable that. Before I turn to a conversation on worship and community, just want to pause to see if anyone has questions. So we have a question from thanks, Vicki. We hold a lot of meetings in the church that can feel hierarchical. Committee meetings, a great example, project planning, curriculum planning, worship planning. Vicki asks, what are some tools we can use to make it easy for everyone to virtually collaborate and feel comfortable sharing ideas? Yeah, great question. I think you saw this prior to COVID, where the default gathering for churches in any kind of a meeting is an in-person gathering. And sometimes churches would bring out like a cell phone and create a conference bridge, and somebody could dial into it. But it was always kind of this experience where if you were dialed in, you're basically on the outside looking into that conversation. There's not a lot of active involvement. Whenever a building's reopen, I would encourage churches to think about the default experience of the meeting as one that is virtually distributed. That doesn't mean that you can't all be gathered in one room. In fact, it's great if you can, but every meeting should afford an opportunity, an invitation for those who can't be present physically to join the conversation. All of you are now power users in Zoom, so you can see how that works. You can invest in some very basic conference call software, or a thing like a USB microphone for your computer to make those who are on the conference call or on the Zoom feel heard. As far as specifically addressing Vicki's idea about feeling comfortable sharing ideas, that takes two things. It takes a posture of invitation from the leaders of the organization. It's not just something where you use a certain technology and collaboration will magically happen. So you really have to be inviting and proactive about being inviting. But there are a number of excellent technologies I would recommend for brainstorming. At the low end of the spectrum, where everyone's kind of familiar with technologies, is Google Docs, just brainstorming in a Google Doc. Other really cool technologies that are free include Trello, which is a project management software where you can do virtual whiteboarding and virtual project management, and it's a cool way to update folks on where different tasks are at. And then there's another tool called Lucidchart, which is a virtual whiteboarding software. So if you want to have a brainstorm with those who aren't gathered in the same place as you, or if you want to run a project with those who aren't gathered in the same place, Trello and Lucidchart are two technologies I would recommend. Other questions, ideas, pushback so far? Well, I'll say a few things about worship and community building then. And when I talk about these, we're going to talk about these in three specific contexts. The context of platforms, which is to say the technologies we use, challenges, what's limiting worship and community at this point, and what are some of the opportunities. So at this point, we're going to pivot from some of the theory of technology to some of the activities of the church. Now, when we talk about platforms, we're talking largely about the big three from the standpoint of worship, and chances are you've probably landed on one of these three, and one of those three is probably working fairly well for you. At this point, 6 months into doing church online, I don't think anyone in your community would be well served by switching from one to the other. Each one of these affords different opportunities. For example, Zoom is really an effective way to promote interactivity, back and forth dialogue. Whereas YouTube is an excellent way to reach anybody on the internet. So it's got reach that is unparalleled. Facebook is excellent because you already have a dialed in audience. Many churches use that as their primary communications and marketing channel prior to March. So each one of these platforms has certain advantages and disadvantages. This point in the pandemic, I wouldn't encourage any ministry to switch up the platform that they're doing, but I would encourage you to think about augmenting what's already working for you with a few new ideas. So one of the ways you can think about worship and community building online is the idea of a live stream experience, as well as the idea of a recorded experience. Slides are going backwards here. And live streaming is excellent because it promotes this spirit of togetherness. There's some forgiveness on content quality. It doesn't need to have the same editing or polish as something that has been recorded. Whereas a recording has some opportunities to really stitch together community contributions. It's also nice because it promotes some ease of access for busy families that might not be able to join a live stream at a given date and time. I think anybody who's tried to sit back and watch a recorded live stream, whether that's a church service 2 hours after the church service finished or a Zoom call the next day, it doesn't quite have the same level of interactivity, the same level of engagement. So I think one of the next steps for churches in this, 7 months into doing church online is to try to incorporate an element of recording if you've primarily been a live streamer, or to incorporate an element of live stream if you've been a recording congregation. One thing I might recommend for live streamers, for folks that have been using things like Facebook Live or YouTube to broadcast their worship, would be to experiment with a Facebook watch party or a YouTube party. These are ways to broadcast recorded content and to have a conversation, to start a discussion with those who are gathered synchronously to watch some sort of recorded content. This might work really well for confirmation class. It might really work really well if you have like Bible study content and you have a video that you want to share with your congregation. With Facebook Watch Party or YouTube Party, anyone who's watching together can comment, they can discuss, you can add discussion questions and have a moderator. I believe at my church, Good Shepherd, there was a watch party earlier this spring for a documentary, and it was aired on Facebook with a watch party, and people could discuss the documentary as they were watching it. So this would be a great way to experiment with recorded content for the first time to augment what's already working. If you've been broadcasting recordings at this point, if your worship service is recording, the next step is not to live stream your worship, but to try to experiment with live posts to Instagram and Facebook Live. Some of the most low-tech congregations I know of are finding a lot of success with Facebook Live and Instagram Live just by having a youth pastor or somebody record themselves for 2 minutes, sharing a quick reflection on the day, maybe doing a brief devotion, some scripture reading. What I like about this live content is it not only affords the forgiveness. People don't expect everything to be polished and buttoned up with live content, but it also provides an opportunity to those who are scrolling through their feed to engage with your content. I found myself watching a Facebook Live video today from Virginia Theological Seminary as I was scrolling through my Facebook feed. If you're doing Zoom, if you're doing worship via Zoom, I think there's an opportunity to continue to lean into the collaboration that Zoom gives you the access to. And I give you a couple of examples here. One is Nadia Bowles-Weber's House for All Sinners and Saints Church that she pastored in Denver, Colorado. And she talks about this in her book, Pastrix, how at the start of every worship, they handed out envelopes to those who wanted them. And those envelopes had different roles for the worship service. You could be a lector, a cantor, a prayer leader. And in those envelopes, it gave you instructions for fulfilling your role and also instructions on how to pass it on to somebody else if you didn't want to do it. Zoom is a great way to get the community involved with your worship. And one of the challenges with church online to this point has been that the church online, the worships online that many of us have experienced, been very pastor driven and staff centric. That's by necessity. We can't have a lot of folks in our building involved in the recording. There are health and safety considerations to think about. But if you're using Zoom, you have a wonderful opportunity to get the congregation engaged in worship leadership. And that in and of itself is a form of community building. I also have a screenshot here of the Episcopal Church's Godly Play materials. I've talked to a couple of Episcopal priests who have recently started using Godly Play at the end of their Zoom worship service just to help their congregation wonder aloud what God is up to in their lives and what God is up to during these difficult times. Let me pause there because I'm going to turn to community in just a moment, but I want to see if there's questions about worship, either about platforms, specific worship technologies, just things you're wondering about the experience of worship online. All right. So let's talk about community. A lot of church leaders that I talk to rightly would point out that they feel that worship online is going well, but something is missing from the community that their congregation once enjoyed. And perhaps your congregation feels similarly. I think there's a big reason why virtual community is so difficult to build right now. And a lot of that has to do with Zoom fatigue and how exhausted we are with the level of digital connection that we've had to figure out how to navigate. Again, I like these Google Trends search snapshots. Nobody had ever heard of Zoom fatigue. And then all of a sudden, April hits and we're all afflicted by it. But the other reality is we're really busy. This is searched out on the idea of a learning pod, of gathering families together in small units to get through school materials. I know so many parents that are working 2 full-time jobs and effectively homeschooling their kids right now. These are really hard times for our communities, So when we talk about building community, not only are we a little burnt out on digital connection, but we're also scrambled on time and everything's just a little frenetic. So these are pretty significant challenges. It's not to say they can't be overcome, but it helps when we talk about community to have a level assessment of what we're dealing with. Oops. The slides keep going the wrong direction. I did have a question here in the Zoom chat. Meredith asked, what present did you communicate with your confirmation class, and in what format? Meredith, maybe you could elaborate on that question in the Zoom chat a little bit, and I'll come back to it. I'm just a little unclear about what you were asking, but I'll be happy to address it. Just a couple of data points then to support the idea that we're a little burnt out, that we're a little frazzled. On average, the workday is now 3 hours longer than prior to COVID. All of those bosses out there that bemoaned their employees working from home and how they'd be lazy and wouldn't get the job done. Well, guess what? The time without commuting, the time without lunch breaks means that the average worker is now working 3 hours longer than they were prior to March. 73% of us are experiencing anxiety 2 or more times per week. And just under half of us are experiencing isolation 2 or more times per week. All of these social support systems, all of these mechanisms that have glued us together all the way up to March have been pulled out from beneath us. This is a hard time. So community is especially difficult to cultivate. Now, there is a way to build community in these digitally distributed times, but that the way to building community is going to require 2 things. The first thing it's going to require is a commitment to going micro. We can't just take the community building programs we had prior to March, move them onto a Zoom and expect them to work. That might work in some contexts, but it's not going to be scalable. People don't have the 90-minute energy for the Bible study on Zoom that they might have had for the Bible study that happened in your fellowship hall. So when we talk about community building, we have to think about small opportunities, short bursts of time and energy, things that aren't going to require great time commitments from our communities. The second thing we ought to think about is the idea that whatever we decide is going to work for our context is going to be unique to our context. When we talk about community in church settings right now, there's not going to be a silver bullet solution. There's not going to be a program that the church-wide ELCA comes up with that works for all of our ELCA congregations. So the process that I would recommend you go through if community is a concern and an opportunity right now is the process of design thinking. And this is a process that's widely used in the technology industry to design software, to create processes, to complete projects. And I really like this process because it leads to solutions that are deeply embedded within the particulars of a specific situation. I won't go through design thinking in great detail on this webinar because there's a lot to say. But I'll say that design thinking starts with a question, like how do we build digital community in our church? It begins with a problem statement, like our church has seen a reduction in community engagements, and as pastors, we're hearing that on a weekly basis. And then it turns to some collaborative brainstorming. That's the ideate phase on this slide. And what design thinking is geared up to do is to generate and test lots of different small prototype ideas that can help you to solve a problem. In this case, the problem might be a lack of community in our contexts. So I would commend to you the idea of design thinking. Check out IDEOU, I-D-E-O-U. They have a number of great training resources on design thinking. And if you make yourself fluent in the art of design thinking, it won't just serve you well for building community during a pandemic. This is a process that you can apply to anything you do in your professional contexts, both now and throughout your career. Just a few closing thoughts on community and worship then. The first is the idea of permanence, not permanence of the pandemic, but the idea of digital ministry only getting started. When we talk about doing worship online, when we talk about building digital community in our churches, these are needs that will last well beyond whenever the pandemic ends. The second thought I want to leave you with is this idea of planning. Our church has moved online in a matter of days. I think my church moved online in 3 days. We found out on a Friday that we weren't going to be open. Our building wasn't going to be open on Sunday. That Sunday was the first worship from home. We can afford to be thoughtful and strategic about where we go next. And I think we should seek to be thoughtful and strategic. So let's carefully consider what our next steps are, both for the coming months of virtual church and when our buildings reopen, how we can seek to build a bridge between the experience of virtual church and church in our building. Finally, I want to leave you with the fact that this is going to be a time of perseverance for all of us. This is going to be work that will challenge us all, and let's seek to learn through it and to learn with grace and patience. This is truly uncharted territory. And with so many ministries not even having a website prior to March, we've had to move so rapidly. So I continue to be impressed at the rate of innovation we see in the church. Just to leave you with a few resources before we go into our breakout sessions. The first is a set of books that I would recommend to anyone that wants to go deeper into this topic. I mentioned one earlier, Deanna Thompson's The Virtual Body of Christ. It's effectively a change management manual. It's a persuasive case about why the church's future is a digital future. The second book I would recommend is Keith Anderson and Elizabeth Drescher's Click to Save Reboot. This is your field guide to the tactics of church online. It'll show you how to do everything from broadcasting a sermon on Facebook Live to creating your congregation's first podcast. It's an excellent resource. And then the third resource is a commentary on the lives of millennials and specifically millennial nuns. It's called Choosing Our Religion by Elizabeth Drescher. And it's a great cultural exploration of the landscape that we're doing ministry in. And it speaks to the idea that I presented with the Google data earlier, that this is an age of immense spiritual curiosity and learning. The challenge for us as church leaders is how to plug into it. There's a couple of good podcasts too that I'd recommend, and here my Luther Seminary bias is going to come out. Two of my favorite professors, Andy Root and Michael Chan, have podcasts that are very well attuned to our digital, to our culture and to this digital moment. So look at New Time Religion by Andy Root and the Gospel Beautiful podcast by Michael Chan. And the other podcast I want to throw out here is a little bit out there, but it's worth a listen if you want to go down a rabbit hole. The Liturgists podcast is a podcast for those who are still interested in the questions that religion seeks to answer, but not so much interested in answering those through a church. So I am no way of endorsing some of their theological positions, but the discussions on the show are fascinating, and they will show you kind of where our culture is at in this moment. I would especially recommend seasons 1 and 2 of that podcast. Finally, there are a number of good training resources that will teach you everything on digital ministry, from how to augment your worship service with song lyrics to how to be more collaborative with your leadership structures. So 2 places I recommend following are the eFormation Learning Community at Virginia Theological Seminary. They have a number of online workshops, webinars, day-long boot camps on different topics related to ministry and tech. And then FaithLead through Luther Seminary is a new platform that offers classes and workshops, again, on many different topics related to ministry. I'm actually going to be teaching a class through FaithLead starting on October 5th. And that class will, over the course of 12 weeks, explore some of the theory of doing church online, and then we'll implement a project in a practicum-based setting where you'll take what you learned from the class and implement it in your congregation. You'll get a lot of small group coaching along the way. So if you're interested in that, feel free to send me an email later and I can send you the enrollment information. Okay, in just a minute, we're going to segue into our breakout discussions, but I want to pause before I reveal the breakout questions to see if any of you have questions or things you'd like to chat about prior to breakout. Okay, so our breakout discussions are, what trends are you noticing in your congregation with regard to engagement and worship attendance? And how are you working to build community and keep your congregation connected? So kind of two broad questions to explore where your congregation is at and what's working for you. So I think Vicki was going to.
Ryan, before we move into those, one other thing I'd like to add, because we have been having these conversations, if anyone's been on with the bishop in this last several weeks. What are some of your aha moments tonight? What are some of the things that you learned tonight that, that you hadn't thought of? So let's add that question to this as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Aha moments, always good. So in just a minute then, you should see on your screen an invitation to join a Zoom breakout room, and that'll divide us into a few different groups, perhaps of 3 or 4 each.
And somebody in your group whose birthday is the closest to today could be the conversation leader. Let's do that. Okay, Robin, we're ready.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Hope the breakout discussions were informative, and I think usually with breakout discussions, they always get cut off at a weird spot. So hopefully you finished your conversation or had some moment of closure. Just a couple of closing items, some shameless self-promotion as well. I do a weekly-ish newsletter on ministry in a digital age, and every week I have a tip of the week to share with church leaders. This week focused on Google Analytics, the week before on Facebook ads. My next series is going to be on educational tools churches can use. So you can follow up, or you can sign up for that on my website, ryanpanzer.com. I also want to put in a plug for the book. So the book comes out December 1st, published by Fortress Press. And since you attended what I might consider a book launch webinar, you can get 30% off the cover price. So the promotion code is Panzer 30, and that's good on the Fortress Press store. The link is here, and I think Vicky is also planning to put that in the Zoom chat as well. As we're waiting on everyone to come back, are there any final questions from tonight's?
Just a question about, I'm attracted to the idea of digital minimalism, kind of trying to differentiate that between, I feel like some of our congregations are digital minimalists by default, by not trying new things. So I wonder about like the difference between digital minimalism and kind of not trying new technologies as they come out. Like, I mean, it's almost like you need a sense of experimentation to find out which technologies serve your values before you decide that they, yeah. So I'm curious if you could clarify that a little bit.
Sure. So I think with any kind of technology, the tendency, especially, by the way, I just put 2 links in the Zoom chat. One of them is the wrong link. The other is the slides for tonight, which are available on Google Docs. The other link is a link to a training outline from a course on mobile software development. So that one might be less relevant to this group, but just a good lesson to look before you paste something into a Zoom chat. If you have questions about mobile software development, let me know. I'm also teaching a class on that right now. So question about like aligning technology use to your values. I think where it's really important to think now is how mission has changed to meet this specific moment that we're in, and it's hard to really think about that with so little time to think about that. But there's almost a work of intentional resetting that can happen here. Churches have always been a little bit slower to adopt new technologies, and I think that's okay to be a little slower to adopt new technologies. 2 pieces of specific advice with that discernment. Always ask the question of why first, and then ask the question of usability. You might have a technology that's going to align to your mission, but if it's not usable in your context, if it's either too complicated or too costly, and specifically, the technology isn't going to go over well. So there's a number of factors that can go into this discernment process, but I would recommend that book. And if you're always one that is a little slower to wade into the waters of new tech, there's no need to start running now.
Any other questions before final announcement and close? And if you think of anything, you can shoot me an email. I'll forward it off to Ryan. We'll get it answered for you if you think of something after the fact. I did have one final announcement. Ryan, did you have anything you wanted to say before I make my final announcement?
No, just an invitation to continue the conversation. I'm fascinated about the intersection of church and technology. So I'm happy to set up a 30-minute Zoom, answer any questions you might have. Just connect with Vicky and we'll set up a conversation from there.
Sounds great. One announcement while I have you all online still. We are, speaking of digital gatherings, we are planning the bishop's installation, and the date, if you haven't noticed it in What Matters, is October 11th. Please put that on your calendars. It will be at 1 o'clock. It will be live streamed. We'll be at an origination site at New Heights Black Earth. But unfortunately, we can't invite you to that, but we can invite you to the live stream. So please put that on your calendar. Watch What Matters for ways that you can get involved. We're asking congregations to pray for the bishop. We've got a coloring activity that we've created. We'd like all generations to get involved in that. So look at What Matters for the instructions for that. And we're asking all female clergy to send us a photo of your ordination, especially the laying on of hands, in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the ordination of women this year. So check out what matters for those invitations. Brian, thank you so much for being with us tonight. You're a delight, and I love your enthusiasm and your knowledge, and we really appreciate you being with us tonight. So, oh, we get clapping of hands from Trevor. Thanks, Trevor.
Well, thank you all so much for joining this afternoon, for your attention and your energy. Looking forward to continuing the conversation, and blessings to all of you as you continue to navigate this new digital normal.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight for this Equipping the Saints webinar. It's always better with you here. Good night.